Hi everyone. So I'm trying to get these screencasts up and running for you, and as a really good friend of mine said, the New Deal is a really big deal. So this is a huge topic. You can go to college and take a whole semester's class just on FDR and the New Deal. So I'm going to try my best to do this in 15 minutes, but I want to encourage you strongly, needless to say, do the reading, outline the DBQ that I'm going to also post for you to do. And I can't emphasize this enough. This is a very basic recap of the New Deal because it's an in-depth topic that's a particularly important topic in today's political climate. So with that in mind, let's talk about it. So the causes of the Great Depression, which will eventually lead to the need or seen by some as the need for the New Deal, is the stock market crash. And everyone knows the stock market crash, but I feel like a lot of people don't fully understand the stock market crash. So what was going on at the time was, in the exuberance of the 1920s, the buying stocks and the Great Gatsby type mentality that we talked about, what was going on was banks started to engage in this practice called buying on margin. Buying on margin is a very unsafe banking practice in which banks were accepting stocks as collateral to loans. So when the banks would loan money to stockbrokers, they would accept the stock that the stockbrokers were buying as collateral. When you take a loan, like for example, some say that the banks were doing something similar recently with the cause of the most recent recession that we had. When you take out a loan, the banks are going to require collateral. So oftentimes, if you take out a loan for the house, they will appraise your house and make sure that it's worth whatever it is that you're borrowing. That way, if you can't pay the loan, they at least have the house and they can sell it and they can get their money back. You can see, I think, how dangerous this is, accepting stock as collateral for a loan. So if I loan you $1 million and you buy $1 million worth of stock with it, and you can't pay that money back, I would get the $1 million of stock. But why wouldn't you be able to pay that money back? Chances are the only reason you wouldn't be able to pay that money back is if the stock dramatically decreased and you lost money. And if that were to happen, then of course the collateral would be almost useless. I love this cartoon because the average person did not lose money in the stock market. This is one of the most common misconceptions of the Great Depression, that people lost all their money in the stock market. No, the banks lost people's money in the stock market. And there were people who would never trust banks again. You may have heard of the cliche of putting money into your mattress or putting money into coffee cans. Doesn't happen as much anymore. But when I was younger, I would remember, there'd be stories in the newspaper about someone who died and they went into the home and they'd find an obscene amount of money, $350,000 stuffed in coffee cans across the apartment. So there were people who never trusted banks again. This is going to be the impetus for the Great Depression. I don't know many people who study history who don't feel that Herbert Hoover got a unfair deal. So I entitled this slide, Poor Herbert Hoover. I'm going to go a little quicker here. Herbert Hoover was, a remarkable man. If you ever read anything about his personal history, he was an orphan, rags to riches. He did tremendous charity work. He was very important in organizing the home front during World War I. He really was one of our most capable presidents, but he became president at the absolute worst time. And he also had this philosophy, maybe born from his own personal struggles, where he did pull himself up by his own bootstraps. He had this personal philosophy where he did not believe that the government should be actively involved in the affairs of individuals. So Herbert Hoover believed that charities were important, that charities could help deal with the poor, but that the government itself shouldn't deal with the poor. Herbert Hoover does a lot compared to past presidents, especially compared to, say, Calvin Coolidge and Warren Harding. Herbert Hoover was very active. He's oftentimes described as doing nothing. That's in comparison to FDR, who passes more laws than any other president in American history. Herbert Hoover actually does quite a bit, considering the time and the political ideology that he had. Having said all that, you got a lot in your mind that you're trying to remember for the AP exam. I'm going to tell you one thing that Herbert Hoover did that's really good, a really good example of his political philosophy. It's called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Sometimes it's shortened to RFC. Now, as we're going to see, FDR had hundreds of laws. His administration is called the Alphabet Administration. There's only one that you have to really remember for Herbert Hoover. It's called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, sometimes referred to as RFC. This is sometimes described as an example of trickle-down economics. So Herbert Hoover is giving loans to businesses, he's giving tax breaks to corporations. He's trying to encourage economic growth by helping the top down. He's trying to help the banks, he's trying to help the credit institutions. He's trying to help the businesses. And his feeling is that if government can help the top, then the bottom will benefit, that this will trickle down. And if we think about that economic cycle that we talked about in class, this is just addressing the economic cycle at a different area. So he's addressing it from the top. Herbert Hoover gives a speech in which he says, America will have a chicken in every pot. And for whatever reason, you know, when FDR says, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, Americans are inspired by it. But when Hoover says Americans are going to have a chicken in every pot, it elicits tremendous anger against Herbert Hoover. There are all these Hooverisms you may have heard of. I'll go through a few. Yeah, the Hoover blanket, that's the cliche guy on the park bench with the newspaper over him. The newspaper would be a Hoover blanket. Hoovervilles are these shanty towns, people being evicted would just make a shack or something, you know, in some area, and there's these shanty towns would develop. Hoover hogs, you know, people didn't have a lot to eat, so they'd catch a rabbit. If you ate a rabbit, you'd be feasting on Hoover hogs that night. And my personal favorite is Hoover flush. If you were playing poker, I don't know if you're familiar with the rules of poker, but if you got 4 of the same suit, that would be considered a Hoover flush. 4 of the same suit isn't worth anything in poker. You want 5 of the same suit. So poor Herbert Hoover, a great man, a passionate individual, dedicated his life to government service after he made a lot of money in business, will go on to be the fall guy for the Great Depression. He really doesn't deserve it. He is swept out of office in 1932. I had to put the electoral map up there just to show you what a landslide victory it was. And it's often during this time period that we talk about a lame duck. A lame duck is a person who is in office, but they lost election. And there's that period in between them losing the election and the new candidate taking over that we call the lame duck period. This was a period that was considered to be such a period of crisis, and so many Americans couldn't wait to get rid of Herbert Hoover, that the 20th Amendment was passed, which moved the inauguration date from March to January. Now, it didn't affect this particular election, but from then on in, we have the inauguration date in January. I love this cartoon, you know, poor Herbert Hoover there with Uncle Sam, and FDR giving a broom because of the clean sweep he's going to make. As a matter of fact, following the period of conservative presidents in the 1920s, FDR is going to pass more laws in his first 100 days than the previous 3 presidents passed in the entirety of their presidencies. So with that in mind, let's dive into FDR's presidency. FDR followed something called Keynesian economics, and I just thought this cartoon was hilarious. It's the idea, Keynesian economics, if we talk about trickle-down economics as helping the top down, you know, let's help the banks, and if the banks are doing well and businesses doing well, people will do well. This is just looking at an economic problem from the exact opposite point of view. Let's help the poor. Let's give jobs, let's give money, let's give support to the poor and middle class. They will take that money and they will spend it, and that spending will help increase the government, will help increase business and industry and help fix the economy. In order to do this, the government needs to deficit spend. This is a really important idea of Keynesian economics. An equally important idea of Keynesian economics is that during times of economic prosperity, the government needs to save. So sometimes that's forgotten about Keynesian economics by both politicians and people who study history, but it's a really important part of Keynesian economics. But I thought this cartoon was very funny because how are we going to fix the economy? Some economists scream save and some economists scream spend. Keynesian economics would be spend, and we're going to talk about how FDR spent. FDR's administration, as I said before, is often called the alphabet administration. Hundreds of programs and laws that all went by these, uh, by their letters. The TVA, the PWA, the WPA, the AAA, the NRA, the CCC, the SEC. It goes on and on and on. FDIC. I'm going to give you a few to kind of hang your hat on, a few examples of some government programs that illustrate FDR's bigger ideas. FDR's basic principle was relief, recovery, reform. So it's relief. We are in crisis. We need to provide relief. We need to help the poor. Recovery, we need to get back on our feet. And reform, we need to make it so this never happens again. This is what FDR spoke of, and this is how I break up his programs. So let's start with relief. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration is one of the earliest examples of welfare in this country. It just gave money to the poor. We might think about the Freedmen's Bureau as being the earliest example, but that obviously was specifically designed to help former slaves. This is really a good example of what we think of as welfare. One of the greatest movies, I'm going to give you some assignments here, not real assignments, you don't have to do it, but I encourage you to watch this movie. I've never met anyone who watched this movie who didn't think it was a great movie. Cinderella Man is the true story of this boxer, James Braddock, and one of my favorite scenes is when he goes into the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to get money. A proud man, he has a hard time doing it. When he later starts to achieve success in the boxing ring, he famously, true story, not just in the movie, he famously goes back and he gives the money back to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. A scene, a movie that's so great for the teaching of the Great Depression, and I guarantee you'll love it. So if it's on Netflix or you can find it out there, and you got an hour and a half to kill, have a little history party. Have your friends over. You guys can watch Cinderella Man. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. This is such an interesting one because it put young, single, urban men to work in national parks, in the woods, building duck ponds. I think of this in part as busy work. You don't really need a duck pond. You don't really need to build trails through national parks. But it was putting young, urban men to work. And young, urban men are who don't have work are very dangerous. This is the demographics that commit crime. So the CCC had a fairly interesting alternative goal, and that alternative goal was to put men at work, and they're up in the woods somewhere, and they send a check home to mom every month. But it also removes a group of people that could be very dangerous to society. After all, when the economy is bad, that's when revolutions happen. So the CCC is fascinating. I wouldn't be surprised, especially if you're an Italian. A lot of New York City Italian men worked in the CCC. I wouldn't be surprised if you start to dig into your family's history a little bit, if you wouldn't find out that a great-grandfather was building duck ponds somewhere upstate New York. FDR declared a bank holiday. I'm going to have you watch another little movie. My favorite scene is when George Bailey, we've probably all seen it, right? It's a Wonderful Life. He's about to go off on his honeymoon. He owns a savings and loans, which is essentially a bank. And when he's driving by the bank, the Great Depression has just kind of hit in full effect, and there's what we call a bank run. And George stops the car. He's going to delay his honeymoon, and he goes into the bank, and there's all these people demanding their money. George Bailey gives the greatest explanation of banks I've ever heard when he says, I'll do my Jimmy Stewart for you here. I haven't gotten your money. Bill's got your money. Jim's got your money. The bank doesn't have your money. The bank loans out money to people to buy houses and cars and go to college, and then they pay it back. So when everyone runs to the banks, the banks fail. And I'm looking at the time here. I'm going to have to pause it. And it looks like I'm not going to do this in 15 minutes.